It was the largest empire in history, almost a quarter of the globe at its height, and it influenced not only world politics and economics, but also shaped the cultural, social, and technological face of the modern world. The saying, "the sun never sets on the British Empire," expressed the very fact that it spanned all the continents, from Canada in the north to Australia in the south, and from India in the east to the Caribbean in the west. Its naval power was mixed with economic dominance and the ability to change according to the changes taking place across the globe. Its legacy, however, is very mixed. It introduced new developments in commerce, infrastructure, and government to many areas, yet also left behind a heritage of exploitation, suppression of cultures, and inequality. The following documentary describes the key moments which have defined both the rise and the fall of the British Empire and its enduring impact on the world. The Age of Exploration, 15th to 17th centuries, saw the laying of the very foundations of the British Empire when the European powers like Spain and Portugal initiated the extension of their influence through sailing. England, although it started somewhat later, took a strong interest in such attempts under the rule of Henry II, who subsidized early attempts at exploration, a prerequisite which created conditions for further voyages. One of the first English claims in the New World was the voyage of John Cabot in 1497 to North America. It was during the reign of Queen Elizabeth I, however, that England started to challenge the supremacy of Spain and Portugal. In 1588, the English Navy defeated the Spanish Armada in a decisive victory that marked a turning point in naval power. The ability thereby given to England to mark the presence of it on the high sea, then starting with voyages by explorers like Sir Francis Drake, and won a number of prestige, besides getting further gain of territory for England. With the establishment of the first colony in the land of the Americas, the colonization of Virginia began with the founding of Jamestown in 1607. Such colonies developed as sources of raw materials and trade, particularly with tobacco and sugar, that provided England with the wherewithal for further imperial ambitions. The geography of England and its developing capabilities on the high seas placed it in a strategic position to control trade routes and thus to initiate a first wave of colonial conquest. Expansion on both accounts of trade and territorial conquest, therefore, characterized the rapidity with which, during the 17th and 18th centuries, the British Empire was taking shape. The most important beginning was the institution of the British East India Company in 1600, destined soon to become, in many respects, a state within a state. The offshoot that began with mercantile purposes in due course began to grow and gain political influence in military matters in the Indian subcontinent. The Battle of Plassey in 1757, where Robert Clive led British forces to victory over the forces of Siraj-ud-Dawla, the Nawab of Bengal, assured British control over Bengal, the major region of India, and hence the seal on British dominance in South Asia. Meanwhile, British colonial holdings in the Americas grew with the establishment of 13 colonies along the eastern seaboard. This was both a search for economic opportunity and an extension of European settlement. At the same time, however, relations between Britain and its American colonies deteriorated to such an extent that the American Revolution, 1775 to 1783, deprived it of these lands. The British regrouped and concentrated their energies elsewhere, especially in India and the Caribbean, where riches from sugar, tobacco, and other cash crops could be extracted. Indeed, this was a very important period in the development of the empire during the late 18th and early 19th century industrial revolution. In particular, the steam engine helped propel the economic growth of Britain and enabled the expansion of the empire with much greater efficiency. Improvements in transportation, such as railways and steamships, allowed for fast movement of goods, people, and troops, thus aiding trade and administration across large expanses. This technological leap helped Britain take a quantum jump in consolidating its power in the world arena. Many personalities influenced the course of the British Empire. Queen Elizabeth I, through her clear vision and patronage of explorers, set the stage for British expansion, while Queen Victoria presided over the empire at its height and personified British imperialism in the 19th century. The leaders, such as Robert Clive in India and Cecil Rhodes in Africa, were those who instituted policies and strategies that made British control grow through military conquest and economic exploitation. These leaders were motivated by everything from economic opportunities to ideological belief in British superiority. Institutionally, the success of the empire rested on institutions like the British East India Company, the Royal Navy, and the British Parliament. Especially the East India Company has combined military and commercial activities and linked trade directly with governance. The Royal Navy secured British supremacy of the seas, protecting vital sea lanes and repressing rival European powers. While Parliament played an important role in imperial policy, it also benefited from the colonial ventures. The economic might of the British Empire was built on trade, especially in such goods as sugar, tobacco, cotton, and later opium. The transatlantic triangular trade played a very important role in bringing wealth to Britain, where enslaved Africans were transported to the Americas to work at plantations supplying raw materials to various British industries. This system of exploitation fueled the growth of the empire, but also left a devastating legacy of racial injustice and exploitation. One of the important factors of its success was British dominance of military forces, especially concerning naval power. The Royal Navy helped to assure the leading place of Britain in trade and provided conditions to project the empire's power as a global actor. The Industrial Revolution that took place in Britain enabled it to produce superior armaments, thereby giving a military advantage over its rivals. British naval dominance was conducive to the subjugation of lands in Africa, Asia, and the Americas. It was a very political, economic, cultural, and ideological entity. It found expression in the civilizing mission ideology, held in its content a moral duty on behalf of Britain to teach Christianity, the values of Europe, and civilization in general to the so-called lesser developed peoples. There it was, serving to rationalize such domination over natives and natural resource exploitation. The missionary works, construction of schools, and the like, infrastructural constructions of railways and improvement in telegraphs were the surest evidence to them of British philanthropy. Nonetheless, it normally obscured those exploitation forms initiated upon colonial subjects, like forced labor and suppression of their culture, and draining out their colonies for their riches. Although some values have been propagated along with the extension of the English language and other legal institutions of theirs, this spread often erased the original culture and practice of a country. The impacts of the British Empire cut both ways. The positive side included a spread of modern infrastructure, railways, ports, and telecommunication systems that facilitated not only trade across vast distances, but also communication for the same distance. The empire promoted the diffusion of ideas, parliamentary governance, the rule of law, and of course, English language and education. These legacies continue to shape the form of former colonies even today. But of course, it had its negative side. Some major features of British colonial rule included the exploitation of resources, enslavement of millions of Africans, and suppression of indigenous cultures. Events such as the Bengal famine of 1943, accentuated by British policies, and the Amritsar massacre of 1919, where British troops killed hundreds of unarmed Indian protesters, well illustrate the human cost of imperialism. These measures instituted a very strong bitterness in people and laid the bedrock upon which all the resistance movements sprouted. From the very inception of the British Empire, different forms of resistance against British imperial rule rose. The American Revolution, 1775 to 1783, had to be amongst the earliest significant impediments to imperial authority that ultimately proved people at the colonial helm were capable of doing uprising against all odds against their masters. The Indian Rebellion of 1857, also known as the Indian Mutiny, was a general rebellion against British rule in India. It was unsuccessful, but it did mark a growing consciousness of discontent with British imperialism. The empire experienced a pan-movement for independence in the 20th century. This was to be led by personalities such as Mahatma Gandhi of India, Kwame Nkrumah of Ghana, and Kenyan leader Jomo Kenyatta. Both world wars weakened Britain further, and with the close of the Second World War, Africa, Asia, and the Caribbean moved with haste into the decolonization process. Colonies turned into independent states. The impact of the British Empire on this date is relevant because it's something whose effects most ex-colonies can still feel economically, politically, and socially. The legacies of inequality, exploitation, and racial injustice flowed from the modern infrastructure and system of government it brought. It has ensured that many of those countries continued to bear negative impacts in various forms: economic exploitation, erasure of cultures, and even slavery marks. Nevertheless, against all odds, the heritage of the British Empire included the establishment of an institution such as the Commonwealth of Nations, a successor organization which tries to create cooperation and solidarity between former colonies. This is barely effectively practiced within all these institutions, with calls for reparations, apologies, and reassessment of colonial history continuing to rise worldwide in several regions of the world. The rise and the fall of the British Empire were lessons in how power, exploitation, and humanness go together. As much as this brought immense benefit to world trade, infrastructure, and governance, it also did harm through the treatment of colonized peoples and resources taken from them in ways that verged on being exploitative. Yet, while the ripples of the British Empire still sound around the globe, much remains in its past to be revisited in question and contest, working to an end that a world taught the lessons of imperialism shall not easily forget.